They thought stealing my parking spot would be a small neighborhood win. Something petty to irritate me, a way for the HOA to assert control over someone they didn't like. But what they didn't know was that the very road they parked on, the very stretch of pavement they guarded with their smug HOA rules and citations, belonged to me legally, fully, and without restriction. And when the moment came, I would remind them that their entire little empire stood on borrowed ground, literally. If you've ever felt like the HOA overstepped and tried to squeeze every ounce of control out of you, then stick around, because this story is going to show exactly what happens when someone like me refuses to bend, refuses to take the harassment, and instead turns their arrogance into a weapon against them. And if you want more stories of homeowners fighting back against power-drunk Karens and overreaching HOAs, make sure to hit that subscribe button now, because this is only the beginning, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. It started one Saturday morning when I came home after a long week at work. I pulled up to my driveway, and for the first time in years, I saw a sleek black SUV parked right in the very spot in front of my house that I had always reserved for my truck. It wasn't a communal space. It was right in front of my property line, clearly marked and used by me for as long as I'd lived there. I honked once, thinking maybe it was a delivery mix-up or some neighbor's guest who didn't realize, but nobody came. I went inside, dropped my bags, and walked back out to find a bright orange citation stuck on my mailbox. The note, stamped with the HOAS seal, read, "Parking spot reallocated for community purposes. Homeowner must park further down the street. Violations will result in fines." My blood boiled instantly. They hadn't just taken my spot. They'd claimed authority over it and fined me for daring to use it. When I marched over to the HOA president's house, a woman named Linda, known around here as the neighborhood queen bee with her clipboard and condescending smirk, she greeted me like I was already guilty of something. "Oh, you saw the notice," she said, sipping her coffee like she was doing me a favor. "We've had complaints that your truck is too large and disrupts the aesthetic balance of the neighborhood. The board voted to reassign your spot for guest parking. You can find alternative parking 2 streets down." I laughed in disbelief, asking her what authority they thought they had to take a spot adjacent to my property, and she said with mock sweetness, "The HOA has jurisdiction over all communal streets and parking spaces. You signed the agreement." That was when I pulled out my trump card. "Not this one," I said. "This road is mine." She frowned, clearly thinking I was bluffing, but I wasn't. Years ago, when I bought my property, I also purchased the undeveloped stretch of road that ran through the neighborhood, a holdover from when the developer hadn't finalized easements and abandoned certain parcels. I'd kept the deed and never transferred it. It's mostly because I liked the security of knowing the road belonged to me. But until now, I had never needed to use that knowledge. But Linda had just given me the perfect reason. She rolled her eyes, called me delusional, and told me to take it up at the next HOA board meeting, where she'd happily explain the bylaws to me. That was the mistake. She thought bylaws could overrule property deeds. That week, I called my lawyer and had him pull up every document, every plat map, every deed that proved ownership of the road. It was crystal clear while the HOA managed the neighborhood. The actual roadbed in front of my house had never been signed over to them, and it legally remained in my name, meaning they had zero jurisdiction. I could put up signs, gates, or even bulldoze the asphalt if I wanted. My lawyer laughed when I told him what happened, saying they just poked a bear without realizing it, and I agreed. At the next HOA meeting, I showed up early and sat in the front row, holding a copy of the deed in a neat folder. The board tried to open with the usual agenda about landscaping budgets and noise complaints. But when my turn came, I slid the documents onto the table and said, "You've been fining me for parking on my own property. Cease immediately, or I'll restrict access." The room went silent. Some board members exchanged uneasy looks, but Linda doubled down, insisting the HOA had authority over all neighborhood infrastructure. That's when I read the legal description out loud, word for word, from the deed, naming the parcel, its boundaries, and my sole ownership. The residents in the back started whispering. A couple even smirked, realizing the queen bee had just been swatted. Linda's face flushed red, and she tried to change the subject. but it was too late. I told them plainly, "From now on, if anyone parks in front of my property without permission, I'll have them towed. And if the HOA continues issuing fines, I'll file harassment charges." The tension exploded after that. Within days, a handful of neighbors started siding with me, saying the HOA had no business stealing spaces or inventing rules. Others, loyal to Linda, grumbled that I was a troublemaker, threatening community harmony, but I didn't care. I parked my truck right back in front of my house, left a copy of the deed in the windshield, and dared them to ticket me again. When I came home one evening to find a stack of fake fines taped to my door, I called my towing company contact and had the black SUV that started all this hauled off the street. Its owner, Linda's daughter. The shrieking fit Linda threw when she saw the tow truck roll off with her precious SUV was the sweetest sound I'd heard all year. That was the spark that lit the fire. Suddenly, it wasn't just about a parking spot. It was about the HOA trying to control what they didn't own, about them abusing authority and thinking no one would push back. They didn't know that I was the worst possible person to pick this fight with, because I didn't just have the paperwork. I had the patience, the resources, and the absolute will to take it all the way. If they wanted to wage war over parking, I was ready to escalate it to property lines, easements, and ultimately, the very existence of their street. And by the time I was done, they would wish they had never taped that citation to my mailbox. The morning after I had Linda's daughter's SUV towed, the neighborhood erupted in whispers, text chains, and angry HOA posts demanding accountability. Some people thought I'd gone too far. Others quietly congratulated me for finally standing up to her. But Linda wasn't about to back down. She marched up my driveway at 7 in the morning, clipboard in hand, slamming it against her palm like she was preparing for battle. "You can't tow community vehicles," she barked. I leaned against my truck, sipping coffee, and calmly said, "Wasn't a community vehicle, Linda. It was parked on my road. And unless you'd like to explain to a judge why you think your family can trespass on private property, I suggest you stop talking." Her eyes narrowed. And for the first time, I saw the flicker of panic in her expression. That moment when a bully realizes their opponent might actually have sharper teeth. She turned and stomped away, but not before promising, "You'll regret this." Later that day, I received a certified letter shoved into my mailbox. The HOA had fined me $2,500 for illegally towing a vehicle. Threatening community members and disrupting neighborhood order, I couldn't help but laugh, because they had no legal authority to impose such fines in the first place. My lawyer confirmed it. In fact, he advised me to keep the letter, because it was evidence of harassment. He even suggested I file a civil suit against the HOA for abusing power. But I wasn't ready to pull that trigger yet. I wanted to watch them dig their hole deeper to give them enough rope to hang themselves. That evening, as I was grilling in my backyard, my neighbor Mike came by. Mike was one of the few decent folks left in the neighborhood, an older guy, ex-military, who had no patience for the HOA's nonsense. He leaned on the fence and said, "You really shook things up, huh? Linda's been calling emergency meetings every night. They're terrified of losing control." I grinned. "Good, they've had it too easy for too long." Mike chuckled and warned me, "Just be careful. People like her don't go down quietly." That was fine by me. I wasn't looking for quiet, I was looking for justice. A few days later, the HOA tried to retaliate. They sent out a mass email declaring that they were instituting new parking restrictions, including permits, decals, and fines of up to $500 per violation. The email was dripping with condescension, warning residents about a certain homeowner spreading misinformation about road ownership. They were trying to paint me as a liar, a rogue neighbor making wild claims. That's when I decided it was time to show my hand to everyone else. I printed out 50 copies of my deed, highlighted the sections showing the road was mine, and went door to door handing them out. Most of the neighbors were shocked. "Wait, you actually own this road?" one woman asked. "Yes," I said flatly, "and I've let everyone use it for years without complaint. But the HOA wants to pretend it's theirs, and now they're targeting me. So, you tell me who's the real problem here?" By the time I got halfway down the block, word had spread. People came out of their houses to ask questions, read the paperwork, and shake their heads at how brazen the HOA had been. A small group of us gathered in Mike's driveway that evening, flipping through the documents while sipping beers. "This is a game changer," one guy said. "If you own the road, then technically the HOA can't enforce anything here without your permission." I nodded. "Exactly. And if they keep pushing, I can declare it unbuildable, shut down access, and force them to reroute traffic." Jaws dropped. I wasn't bluffing either. If I wanted to, I could file paperwork with the county to limit public access, effectively stranding the HOA's beloved vacation cabins, playgrounds, and even Linda's own cul-de-sac. The thought made me smile. But Linda wasn't going to let go without a fight. At the next HOA meeting, she showed up with her attorney in tow, a smug-looking man in an expensive suit who clearly thought he could intimidate me. The room was packed. Neighbors wanted to see what would happen. Linda opened the meeting with her usual pomp, announcing serious concerns about my misrepresentation of property rights. Then, her lawyer stood and tried to argue that while the deed may list my ownership, the practical use of the road fell under HOA jurisdiction due to implied easements and community reliance. I let him talk for 10 minutes, spouting legal jargon designed to confuse the audience, before I raised my hand. "Are you finished?" I asked. He smirked and nodded. That's when I pulled out not just the deed, but also a county map showing clear boundaries, a letter from the county recorder's office confirming my ownership, and a statement from my lawyer asserting my legal right to control access. The crowd erupted in whispers. Even some board members looked uneasy. Linda's face went pale. She tried to shout over me, saying I was endangering the neighborhood, threatening safety, and acting selfish, but it was too late. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "This isn't about safety. It's about your ego. You thought you could bully me, and now the whole neighborhood knows you overplayed your hand. From this moment forward, every car parked on my stretch of road without my permission will be considered trespassing, and I will act accordingly." Gasps filled the room. The meeting descended into chaos, with residents arguing on both sides. Some accused me of being power-hungry. Others defended me, saying the HOA had no right to steal what wasn't theirs. In the end, the meeting adjourned without resolution, but the battle lines were clear. The next morning, I put up 2 metal signs on either end of my section of road: private property, parking by permission only. Violators will be towed. Sure enough, Linda came storming down within an hour, screaming that I couldn't just claim public roads as private. I calmly pointed to the deed taped under one of the signs and said, "It's not public, mine." She threatened to call the police, and I welcomed it. When the cops showed up, I handed them the deed. They read it, shrugged, and told Linda, "Ma'am, he's within his rights. Nothing we can do." The look on her face was priceless. She had always relied on calling the authorities to back up her bullying, but now even they were powerless against me. After that, things got ugly. The HOA began a smear campaign, spreading rumors that I was planning to sell the road to developers or block emergency vehicles out of spite. They papered the neighborhood with flyers painting me as a dangerous neighbor, threatening everyone's safety. But instead of turning people against me, it backfired. More and more residents started realizing how manipulative the HOA was and how much power they tried to exert over things they didn't even own. Some even began quietly asking me if there was a way to dissolve the HOA altogether. That's when I realized I had more leverage than I thought. Not only could I defend myself, but I could dismantle the entire HOA if I played this right. I started documenting everything, every letter, every fine, every false claim. I compiled it all into a neat binder, ready to present in court if needed. But before I even got that far, Linda made her biggest mistake yet. One evening, I came home to find that my signs had been ripped out of the ground and tossed into my yard. Spray paint covered my mailbox with the words "Community Road." I checked my cameras, and sure enough, there was Linda herself in the middle of the night, committing vandalism. I couldn't believe her stupidity. The next morning, I filed a police report, handed over the footage, and pressed charges. Within 24 hours, Linda was served with a notice to appear in court for trespassing and vandalism. The HOA Queen Bee was finally facing consequences, and the entire neighborhood knew it. That's when the whispers turned into outright rebellion. Neighbors began questioning why they were paying hundreds of dollars in HOA fees for nothing but harassment and legal trouble. Some stopped paying altogether. Others started holding informal meetings without the board, discussing ways to vote out Linda and dissolve the HOA. I didn't even have to push, was happening on its own. All I had to do was sit back and let the cracks widen. And as I watched Linda scramble to hold on to power, I knew it was only a matter of time before the entire street I owned became the weapon that ended her reign for good. The weeks following Linda's court summons were unlike anything I had ever seen in our neighborhood. For years, the HOA had been untouchable, its board members strutting around like mini dictators with Linda at the helm. Now, that power structure was beginning to crumble, and it was all because I refused to let them trample on me. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out suddenly felt emboldened. People came up to me during walks, thanking me for standing up to the HOA. They asked questions about their own rights, wondering if the fines and threats they'd endured for years were even enforceable. The truth was, most of those so-called rules carried no legal weight at all. And when I showed them the evidence of my deed and the footage of Linda spray painting my mailbox, their faith in the HOA evaporated almost overnight. But Linda wasn't about to surrender. She doubled down, calling emergency HOA meetings nearly every night. She sent out emails with subject lines like, "Protect our neighborhood from rogue homeowners and stop private tyranny." It was laughable, really. She was trying to paint me as some villain hoarding power, when in reality, I had simply exercised the rights I had always had. She even went door to door herself, knocking on people's homes, spinning wild stories about how I planned to block fire trucks and ambulances from entering the street, or that I was negotiating with out-of-state developers to sell the road and bulldoze their homes. A few gullible neighbors believed her, but the majority didn't. Most had seen enough with their own eyes to know who was lying. Then came the day of her first court hearing. I showed up in my best suit, calm and collected, binder in hand with every document I'd gathered. Linda, on the other hand, looked frazzled, but tried to mask it with her usual smugness. Her lawyer stood beside her, shuffling papers nervously. The judge took one look at the video evidence clear as day, showing Linda tearing my signs out of the ground and spray painting my property, and immediately dismissed her attorney's attempts to downplay it. "Ma'am," the judge said firmly, "this is criminal vandalism. You trespassed, damaged private property, and attempted to intimidate a legal landowner. This court does not tolerate such behavior." Linda's face turned crimson. She tried to argue, tried to shout about community rights, but the judge shut her down. She was fined, ordered to pay for damages, and warned that any further incidents could result in jail time. For once, she had no comeback. I walked out of that courtroom with a smile, the neighbors buzzing with excitement as news spread like wildfire. From that day forward, Linda's grip over the community began to slip through her fingers. People started questioning every decision the HOA board made. Some refused to pay their monthly dues, demanding to see where the money was going. Rumors circulated about mismanaged funds, unapproved expenses, and even kickbacks Linda had allegedly taken from contractors. The more people questioned, the more cracks appeared in the HOA's carefully crafted facade. And I was more than happy to fan those flames by sharing my own evidence of their lies. The tipping point came when one of the other board members, a man named Carl, approached me in secret. He was tired of Linda's antics, tired of being dragged into lawsuits and fights because of her obsession with control. "Listen," he said quietly one evening as we stood by my truck. "I don't agree with everything you've done, but I'll admit I've exposed her. The HOA's finances aren't what she claims. If you're willing to push, I'll hand over documents that could sink her for good." My interest piqued immediately. "What kind of documents?" I asked. Carl handed me a folder stuffed with spreadsheets and receipts. Proof of mismanagement. She's been using HOA funds for personal expenses, strips, spa visits, even furniture for her house. If the members see this, she's done. I spent the next 2 nights combing through every page. Carl wasn't exaggerating. Linda had been siphoning thousands of dollars from the HOA, funneling it into her own lifestyle while raising fees on struggling families. The hypocrisy was staggering. With this evidence, I didn't just have leverage, I had the bullet that would end her reign once and for all. I called my lawyer, and together we prepared a presentation. The next HOA meeting would be the battleground, and I intended to win. When the night arrived, the clubhouse was packed to capacity. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. Linda strutted to the front of the room like she still owned the place, but I noticed her confidence faltering as people whispered around her. When the meeting opened, she launched into another rant about me, about my dangerous behavior and how I was tearing the community apart. That's when I stood up, binder in hand, and calmly said, "If we're talking about tearing the community apart, maybe we should talk about what you've been doing with everyone's money." Gasps echoed around the room. Linda froze. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. I opened the binder and began laying out receipts, line by line, showing spa trips, hotel bills, expensive dinners all paid with HOA funds. The crowd erupted. People shouted, demanding answers. Linda stammered, tried to deny it, but Carl stood up and confirmed what I was saying. The board was caught in the middle of the storm, powerless to stop it. Neighbors began shouting for her resignation. Some even threatened to call the police right there and then. Linda's face turned beet red as she tried to regain control, but it was hopeless. The evidence was overwhelming. People were livid, demanding not only her removal, but also a full audit of the HOA's finances. For the first time in years, the power balance had shifted, and Linda was on the ropes. I stood silently, letting the neighbors do the talking, their outrage louder than anything I could have planned. By the end of the night, Linda stormed out of the clubhouse, her authority shattered, her allies scattering. But I wasn't done yet. I knew that even if she was disgraced, she'd try to claw her way back. That's what bullies like her did. So, I started preparing for the next phase. With the community's trust on my side and the evidence of her corruption in my hand, I began drafting the paperwork that would make my threat a reality, declaring the street unbuildable. I hadn't pulled that trigger yet because I wanted to wait for the perfect moment, the strike that would leave no chance of recovery. And as Linda's world collapsed around her, I knew that moment was coming soon. One night, as I sat on my porch watching the sun dip behind the trees, Mike came over with 2 beers. He handed me one and said, "You know, you're changing everything around here. People aren't scared of them anymore. You've given everyone backbone." I smiled, taking a sip. "Good, because the fight isn't over. Linda may be down, but she's not out. And when she tries to make her comeback, that's when I'll finish this once and for all." Mike chuckled. "I almost feel sorry for her." I didn't. Not one bit. The weeks following the county's ruling and the first resignations from the HOA board felt like standing on the edge of a shifting tide. Because while it was clear that Linda's one-siren grip had weakened, she still had pockets of support and still believed she could outlast everyone else. And so what unfolded next was a drawn-out battle not in a courtroom, but in living rooms, sidewalks, and mailbox clusters, where neighbors wrestled with whether the HOA would remain in any form or dissolve entirely. I watched as she tried to stir dissent by showing up uninvited to people's porches, waving legal documents that looked intimidating but meant little, insisting that without her leadership, property values would collapse and crime would run rampant. But the truth was that people had begun to experience the opposite. They felt freer, lighter, less anxious, now that her endless fines and threatening letters had stopped. And when residents realized they could mow their lawns without measuring blade height or parked their cars overnight without a ticket slipped under the wiper, they began to understand that community wasn't defined by punishment but by trust, which eroded Linda's arguments faster than any legal motion could. Still, there were moments of uncertainty. The interim board, made up of volunteers who stepped in after the resignations, faced the monumental task of organizing transparent meetings, cataloging years of documents, and preparing a vote on the HOA's future, all while Linda and her few loyalists sabotaged wherever they could, refusing to hand over records, locking cabinets, and spreading rumors that anyone who voted to dissolve would be liable for debts the HOA had accrued. The scare tactics worked on some, creating real fear. But that's when the audit team I'd supported came forward with clear summaries showing exactly what debts existed, what funds were recoverable, and how state law protected individual homeowners from collective liability. An education that transformed fear into resolve. Because once the numbers were demystified, people realized the situation was salvageable, and that Linda's scare tactics were hollow. The tension reached a breaking point at the first open meeting where the community gathered to discuss dissolution. It was held in the elementary school gym, and the turnout was massive, with chairs filling quickly and people lining the walls, many of them clutching packets the interim board had mailed out summarizing finances, bylaws, and the county's ruling on the road. Linda arrived late, storming in with a binder under her arm and a loud proclamation that the meeting was illegitimate, but for the first time no one ceded the floor to her. And instead, one of the interim chairs calmly asked her to wait her turn, like everyone else. The power dynamics had shifted so completely that you could see the disbelief in her eyes. She had lived for years on the assumption that fear and bluster would always win. But now the crowd was engaged, alert and ready to hold her accountable. As neighbors took the microphone one by one, their stories poured out. A young couple who had nearly lost their savings to fines over a mailbox paint color. An older veteran who had endured harassment for keeping his flag displayed past sunset. A widowed mother who had been cornered by Linda in her driveway over a cracked flower pot. Each testimony painted a picture not of a benevolent association but of a petty dictatorship that had crushed joy in the very homes people had worked so hard to afford. And you could see the shame creeping into the faces of the few loyalists still clinging to Linda's side. When it was finally her turn, Linda launched into a tirade about order, about standards, about how without her the neighborhood would collapse into weeds and chaos. But the words rang hollow in the face of evidence and lived experience. And when she tried to dismiss the audit as fabricated, the independent accountant stood up, a calm professional, and explained that the figures had been verified against bank statements and county filings. Evidence that could stand in any courtroom, which silenced the room with its finality. The vote that night didn't dissolve the HOA outright that required a more formal process, but it did produce a supermajority, mandate to strip Linda and her loyalists of any remaining authority, to freeze accounts until a full legal resolution, and to set a date for the binding dissolution vote. And when the tally was announced, cheers erupted that echoed off the gym's high ceiling. Cheers not just of victory but of release, because people felt they were taking their community back from fear. Linda stormed out before the meeting ended, slamming the doors so hard they rattled. But the symbolism was undeniable. The community had moved on, and her relevance was fading with every passing day. In the aftermath, the real work began, because while it was tempting to declare victory, the volunteers now had to oversee the transition. A grueling process of filing legal paperwork, negotiating the release of liens the HOA had placed on properties, and working with the county to determine which services would revert to municipal management and which would need cooperative agreements among neighbors. It was messy, tedious work. But what struck me most was the way people showed up. Neighbors who had never spoken before now sat side by side in living rooms, sorting through boxes of old files, drafting bylaws for a new, voluntary association that would focus only on essentials like shared utilities, and planning potlucks to rebuild trust that had been shattered by years of suspicion. The road itself, ironically, became a symbol of that change. Where once it had been a battlefield of fines and power plays, it was now the backdrop for block parties, for children's chalk drawings, for impromptu basketball games under the shade of the protected trees. And every time I walked down it, I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that by standing my ground, by exposing Linda's corruption, I had helped protect not just my rights, but the soul of the community. Of course, Linda didn't vanish quietly. She filed lawsuits, 3 in total, accusing the interim board of malfeasance, accusing me of slander, accusing the county of overreach. But each one faltered under the weight of evidence, and the simple fact that courts don't look kindly on serial filers with reputations for mismanagement. And when the third case was dismissed with prejudice, the judge even scolded her for wasting judicial resources, a humiliation she couldn't spin into a narrative of victimhood. By then, Her circle of supporters had dwindled to almost nothing, and even they began to peel away, exhausted by the constant battles and the growing realization that Linda wasn't fighting for principle but for ego. The most ironic part came months later when a real estate firm released updated property value assessments for the area and found that values had actually risen after the HOA's power collapsed, a result of reduced hostility and increased buyer interest in a neighborhood that had thrown off the yoke of authoritarian governance. It was the ultimate rebuke to Linda's fear-mongering, proof that freedom and cooperation, not micromanagement, made a community thrive. For me, the battle had begun over something as mundane as a parking spot. A petty attempt by Linda to flex control, but it had grown into something far larger. A reckoning with what happens when unchecked power festers in small corners of civic life. And as I looked at my neighbors laughing together at the next block gathering, free from the weight of her oversight, I knew that every sleepless night, every court filing, every ounce of energy had been worth it because we had proven something essential. No one person, no matter how loud or ruthless, can own a community that chooses to stand together. Once Linda's mask slipped and the board's dirty receipts lay exposed, the neighborhood split into two clear camps: those who'd spent years under her small, petty tyranny and were finally ready to reclaim their streets, and those who'd believed the polished narrative and couldn't imagine life without the HOA's enforced order. And in the thick of that fracture, I began executing the plan I'd been assembling. In the quiet hours, the legal declaration that the road running past my house was unbuildable for HOA structures and expansions. A move grounded in zoning statutes, environmental assessments, and a detailed set of surveys showing that the strip contained critical drainage easements and a heritage tree line. It's protected under county ordinances. All paperwork I'd had my attorney prepare carefully, not as an offhand threat, but as a solid, unassailable instrument designed to remove the very leverage Linda had tried to abuse. I filed the motion with the County Planning Commission, accompanied by engineered reports proving that the soil under the road had a high clay content and poor load bearing characteristics, that any heavy construction, added paving, or installation of permanent fixtures would jeopardize the stormwater system that ran directly beneath the surface and risk flooding for a dozen homes downhill. And because I wasn't reckless, I included an independent arborist's assessment confirming that several mature maples and oaks along the verge were protected by a local conservation statute and could not be removed or disturbed. Without special permits denied in the past too, even the county itself, the paperwork was precise, legally vetted, and devastatingly effective, because it didn't rely on chest beating or public fury, but on the quiet authority of technical facts that public officials could not ignore. When the Planning Commission scheduled a hearing, Linda believed she still had time to spin the narrative. She held emergency meetings, sent glossy flyers, and pulled together sympathetic neighbors to testify that the HOA's planned improvements were necessary for community safety and value, but the tone changed in the room when my engineer explained, with diagrams and cross-sections projected onto a screen, how the hydrology of our road was precarious, and how any additional load could collapse the subsurface culverts. And then the arborist spoke, gently but firmly, about the irreplaceable canopy that shaded the whole block and how the roots extended beneath the asphalt in ways the HOA's contractors had neglected to consider. You could sense the air draining from the room as the technical specialist spoke in a language that stripped away Linda's theatrics and replaced it with irrefutable municipal concern. The commission wasn't hostile to development, they were there too. Protect long-term safety and compliance, and once the experts had laid out the facts, the commissioners asked pointed questions about inspections the HOA had allegedly skipped and whether the board had ever sought the proper permits for prior work. And when the staff dug into old files, they found, to their displeasure, a pattern of informal approvals and unsigned inspection memos that Linda had kept hidden in a drawer. Evidence of a culture of cutting corners that suddenly made the commission's eyebrows rise in unison. Linda's supporters tried to attack my motives, painting me as vindictive and selfish for blocking progress, but when one elderly neighbor stood up and said, in a voice that carried the weight of decades living on that street, that he treasured the trees and didn't want to see his home flood because someone wanted a prettier curb. The room shifted in a direction Linda couldn't steer back. It's astonishing how one simple, honest voice can puncture a manufactured narrative faster than any number of glossy handouts. After several hours of testimony, the commission voted to designate the stretch as restricted, effectively preventing the HOA from installing structural changes, tall fixtures, or widening the asphalt without an extensive engineering remediation plan and a public environmental review, an outcome that left Linda furious, but operationally helpless. Because the county's decision carried enforcement teeth, and it meant any future attempts to change the road would invite fines and stoppage orders. I could have celebrated then, but I knew dismantling a culture of entitlement doesn't happen with a single county stamp. It happens in the slow grind of enforcement, audits, and public education. So I continued pushing, working with neighbors to demand a forensic audit of HOA finances, to review bylaws that had been stretched into a weapon, and to install a community oversight committee that would replace the old board and run the HOA transparently, or, if the community chose, wind it down completely. Linda, true to form, didn't relent. She filed an appeal against the commission's decision, hired a new attorney with a reputation for delay tactics, and used every procedural lever she could to keep the matter in limbo, hoping that time and noise would blunt the effects of the technical facts. But procedural bait rarely stands up to the light of transparency once neighbors are informed and invested. And by the time discovery began in earnest, the investigation turned up more troubling items. Invoices billed to the HOA for consulting fees that mirrored payments to companies registered in Linda's sister's name. Credit card statements with personal purchases funneled through HOA accounts. And a series of poorly documented emergency repairs that coincided suspiciously with vacations. Linda inexplicably took 2 distant resort towns. Each new discovery tightened the legal noose and eroded the social capital Linda had banked on for years. Former allies who had once nodded obligingly in board meetings found themselves avoiding her calls, and the local paper ran a piece that reframed the whole controversy as a case study in how small power brokers can weaponize governance when there are no safeguards. The community reaction was electric. People who had long felt powerless came forward, asking how they could access meeting minutes from the previous 5 years, demanding that procurement processes be public, and volunteering to sit on oversight panels. What had started as my defense of a parking spot had grown into a civic renewal. An embarrassment for Linda, but a profound opportunity for the neighborhood to reclaim stewardship. As the legal skirmishes continued, Linda attempted a few scorched earth moves. She tried to convene a special meeting to strip me of access rights by falsely claiming the deed had been superseded by recorded neighborhood easements. She sent cease and desist letters to neighbors who spoke with reporters, and in a desperate attempt to rally supporters, she staged a high-profile community cleanup designed to paint herself as a devoted steward. But the optics had shifted too far. People saw through the PR and recognized it for what it was: damage control. One of the most poignant moments came when a group of younger families organized a block barbecue to celebrate the trees and express support for open governance. Their turnout dwarfed Linda's staged event, and their laughter and casual conversations under the very canopy she'd tried to strip away felt like a small reclaiming ritual. Proof that community is built on relationships, not bylaws enforced by fear. Meanwhile, my lawyer worked methodically to convert the audit findings into legal remedies. Civil suits against board members who had misappropriated funds. Motions to invalidate votes taken under false pretenses. And petitions to the county for enforcement rights where the HOA had acted beyond its authority. The tactics were surgical, aimed not at personal revenge but at restoring the rule of law and ensuring that no future president could treat the association as a private slush fund. The pressure forced Linda into a corner. She slipped into litigation and PR casualties. Her social media presence became a series of defensive posts and angry rants. And a few of the contractors who'd once lined up for HOA jobs started refusing, citing reputational risk. The turning point for the HOA's internal dynamics came when a routine bank reconciliation turned up a large missing payment earmarked For road maintenance a payment, that couldn't be, explained Dan, when confronted. The then treasurer either invoked attorney-client privilege or fell silent, an action that terrified more conservative board members who realized they could no longer pretend ignorance. With those revelations, several board members publicly resigned, citing personal reasons, and new interim leaders and neighbors of long-standing integrity stepped up, determined to run the HOA openly or to shepherd its dissolution if the community so desired. They immediately enacted transparency protocols, posted minutes, created an open procurement process, and initiated a member vote to decide the HOA's future. Linda, sensing the end, tried once more to rally the holdouts by threatening litigation against any member who helped dissolve the association, but her threats rang hollow. The county designation of the road as restricted made the board's infrastructure plans moot, and the town's attorney cautioned that further self-dealing could mean personal liability for any remaining officers. In quiet conversations, older neighbors told stories about how the HOA had once been a useful coordinating body in the early days, repairing mailboxes, pooling funds for a shared mailbox, organizing block parties, and how Linda's turn to authoritarian tactics had perverted what should have been communal care into a means for personal enrichment. That memory HOA as servant, not ruler, resonated, and the vote to convert the organization into a minimal service cooperative or dissolve it outright gained traction. A democratic solution to the problem of cons. The weeks after the courthouse vote felt like the dawn of an entirely new era for our community, because although the legal dissolution of the HOA had been finalized, the impact of that moment went far beyond paperwork, rewrote the very fabric of how neighbors saw themselves and each other, and it changed the balance of power from fear to freedom. Suddenly, people were free to decorate their homes without dread, plant gardens without tape measures, scrutinizing flower beds, and park cars without wondering if some notice would appear under the windshield wiper. And while that may sound like small reliefs to an outsider, for us they were enormous victories that carried the weight of years of oppression being lifted. And the laughter, the joy, the casual conversations at mailboxes were proof that community had returned stronger than before. The block party we threw a week later was more than a celebration. It was a declaration of independence. With food tables stretching the length of the street, kids riding bikes where signs once prohibited them, music playing from speakers without fear of citation, and a bonfire at night where neighbors told stories of all the ridiculous fines and intimidation tactics they'd endured, each story met with laughter that wasn't just about humor, but about reclaiming dignity from the absurdity of what Linda and her loyalists had tried to enforce. And as I stood among them, I realized that something remarkable had happened. We weren't just free from a corrupt HOA. We were bonded together in a way that no HOA rulebook could ever have created. Linda, of course, was nowhere to be seen, and while rumors swirled that she was still plotting appeals or trying to resurrect her authority in some form, the truth was, she had lost her audience. She had become irrelevant, a ghost of her former power. And when her once fanatical supporters stopped answering her calls and emails, she retreated into silence, leaving behind only the hollow echo of her failed empire. Meanwhile, the county began to recognize our neighborhood as a kind of model for grassroots resistance, sending representatives to observe how we were managing without an HOA, how we were cooperating voluntarily on issues like snow removal, street lighting, and community watch, and what they saw surprised them. Instead of chaos, they found order, not imposed, but chosen. Because neighbors who had been adversaries under Linda's regime were now allies, pitching in, sharing costs, and volunteering time. And it proved the point we'd been making all along, that people don't need authoritarian micromanagement to live responsibly. They just need the freedom to collaborate without fear. The road itself, the very one Linda had tried to control through petty fines and lies, became a symbol of that triumph. Once contested, it was now lined with chalk drawings from children, parked cars that no one questioned, and banners from community events. And each time I walked it, I remembered how this entire battle had started with something as petty as a stolen parking spot, how it had escalated into lawsuits and power struggles, and how, by standing firm and refusing to be bullied, I had helped ignite a chain of events that toppled an entire corrupt system, leaving behind not rubble, but renewal. Looking back, I often thought about how close I had come to giving in at various points, when Linda's threats seemed endless, when the legal system seemed sluggish, when I wondered if it was worth the stress. But standing there now, watching neighbors who had once been strangers laughing together, I knew with certainty that persistence had been worth it, that justice had been worth it, and that freedom, no matter how small it seemed in daily details, was always worth fighting for. Yet, even as life settled into its new rhythm, there was an unspoken vigilance among us. We knew power has a way of creeping back in when unchecked, that someone else could one day try to exploit the system the way Linda had. And so we remained watchful, not paranoid, but prepared, with the understanding that the greatest safeguard of freedom is community solidarity. And that lesson became the enduring legacy of our struggle. Years from now, when newcomers move in and ask why our neighborhood doesn't have an HOA when so many around us do, I'll be able to tell them the story, not just of a battle over a parking spot, but of how ordinary people stood up against corruption, how we dismantled a toxic regime, and how we proved that unity can overcome even the most entrenched abuse of power. And I'll watch their eyes widen as they realize they're living in a place where history was made. The truth is, it wasn't just about the road or the fines or even Linda. It was about refusing to surrender dignity to someone who thrived on control, about drawing a line and holding it, and about showing future generations that they don't have to bow to injustice, no matter how small or local it seems, because every act of resistance matters. And so, as the final sparks from the block party's bonfire floated into the night sky, I felt a profound sense of closure, but also a new beginning. Because the end of the HOA wasn't the end of our story, it was the start of a community, defined not by rules and punishments, but by resilience, trust, and courage. If you followed this journey, if you felt the weight of injustice and the relief of freedom through these words, then take this as your reminder. Never let fear silence you. Never let corruption win unchecked. And always stand with your neighbors when truth is on your side. Because together, you can topple even the strongest tyrant. And if you want more stories of battles fought and victories won against injustice, don't forget to subscribe to Sham Stories. You won't want to miss what comes next. In the months that followed the decisive community meeting and the stripping of Linda's authority, the neighborhood began to experience something it hadn't in years: breathing room. Because the once omnipresent anxiety of an HOA gone rogue was being replaced with a cautious optimism. Though the journey toward fully dissolving the HOA was far from over, and the battles that remained would test whether the community could stay united without fracturing under pressure. What I saw happening was both inspiring and exhausting. As committees of ordinary neighbors, teachers, plumbers, retirees, young parents stepped up to handle tasks once monopolized by Linda's inner circle, like managing common funds, reviewing property liens, and coordinating with the county over road maintenance. Only this time, everything was transparent. Meetings were recorded. Minutes were distributed to every mailbox, and decisions were debated openly rather than imposed by decree. And that transparency became a sort of medicine for wounds inflicted over the years. But it also revealed just how deep those wounds went, because some families were still entangled in legal liens. Some still owed absurd fines that were tied to HOA records, and the path to freeing them required paperwork, hearings, and sometimes direct intervention from county clerks. For Linda, who had lost her formal power but not her bitterness, this was an opportunity to reassert herself in petty ways. She would show up at clerk offices to contest filings. She would stalk board volunteers in the parking lot, muttering threats about lawsuits. She even set up a blog where she posted exaggerated stories painting herself as a victim of a witch hunt, but the difference now was that no one in the neighborhood believed her. And worse for her, the wider county had grown weary of her antics. So when she tried to rile up allies outside the neighborhood, people were skeptical, asking why so many courts had ruled against her and why so many neighbors had united to oppose her if she was truly a misunderstood leader. I remember one particular evening when the interim board hosted a gathering at the community park to answer questions about the dissolution process. It wasn't official business, just neighbors gathering on picnic tables under string lights, eating potluck food and talking openly. But it was the kind of event Linda would have once crushed with citations and police calls. Yet this time, with her stripped of power, the event went on peacefully, filled with laughter and a sense of belonging, until Linda herself arrived, storming across the grass with papers in hand, demanding the microphone to set the record straight. But instead of cowering, the crowd collectively turned their backs, refusing to engage. A symbolic rejection so powerful that Linda, red-faced and furious, left within minutes, muttering threats under her breath. That was the moment I realized her reign wasn't just legally over. It was socially dead, because once a community denies someone their audience, their ability to control evaporates completely. Meanwhile, the county process of officially dissolving the HOA moved forward, a labyrinth of filings, hearings, and verifications that required nearly every homeowner to sign off. But instead of being a burden, it became a unifying project. Neighbors helped each other navigate forms. Older residents who struggled with online systems were assisted by younger families. And little by little, the signatures added up until we reached the threshold needed to dissolve permanently, which would culminate in a final vote scheduled months later at the county courthouse. The anticipation built like a storm on the horizon, because everyone knew this wasn't just a procedural step, but the official end of years of fear. And Linda knew it too, which is why she threw every last bit of energy into sabotaging it. She filed one last lawsuit claiming the dissolution violated state law. But it was dismissed almost immediately because similar cases across the state had already set precedent. She tried to run for a county seat, hoping to gain leverage from the inside, but her reputation tanked her campaign before it ever began. She even hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on me and the interim board, a desperate move that backfired when the investigator himself grew uncomfortable with her erratic behavior and leaked her instructions to the press, turning her into a laughingstock in the local news cycle. The irony was brutal. She had tried to ruin me with the parking spot feud, only to destroy her own credibility in the process. And as the community grew stronger, she grew smaller, like a shadow shrinking in the light. Yet even as the big picture tilted in our favor, the day-to-day was still a grind, because undoing years of bad governance left scars. One neighbor discovered her home's title had an active lien placed by Linda's old board that hadn't been properly discharged, requiring months of legal wrangling to clear. Another neighbor nearly lost a refinancing deal because HOA fines appeared on a credit report. I found myself testifying at hearings not just for my case but to support others, making clear to county officials how systemic Linda's abuse had been. And though it was draining, it reinforced the idea that none of us were fighting alone anymore, which kept morale from collapsing during setbacks. The most telling change came not in paperwork or lawsuits, but in how people began treating each other. Instead of hiding behind curtains when someone walked by, neighbors began waving, chatting, inviting each other for coffee, reclaiming the sense of community that Linda had poisoned. And the road itself became a symbol of resilience. It no longer carried the weight of her power. It became a shared space where children played without fear of fines, where families parked freely, where holiday lights strung across porches glowed without threat of citation. And with every passing week, the neighborhood looked less like a battlefield and more like a home. By the time the county announced the official date for the dissolution vote, anticipation reached a fever pitch. People marked calendars, planned carpools, and even made t-shirts with slogans like "Free at last" and "No more HOA," a kind of grassroots movement fueled by relief and defiance. And when the day finally came, we filled the courthouse like a tidal wave of determination, lining hallways, filling seats, and holding our breath as the count began. Linda sat in the back, a diminished figure clutching yet another binder of useless papers, her face twisted in a mixture of anger and desperation. But it didn't matter anymore. The outcome was inevitable, the numbers too overwhelming, the tide too strong, and when the dissolution passed with a supermajority so decisive that even the clerk looked moved by the turnout, The cheer that erupted was louder than anything I'd ever heard in that building, echoing through the marble halls like the sound of liberation itself. In that moment, the neighborhood wasn't just free from Linda's grip. It was free from the illusion that it ever needed her. And as we walked out into the sunlight, laughing, hugging, and planning the block party to celebrate, I caught one last glimpse of Linda standing alone in the shadow of the courthouse, binder pressed against her chest, as if it could shield her from the reality that her empire had crumbled. And for the first time in years, I felt no fear, only a deep and steady peace. Because the war was over and the community had won.